This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library of
You can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price that you can get Truefire All Access for. One of the things that I've heard so much growing up, and even, into my adult life, is this idea of you get what you pay for. And I don't think it's really even particularly true anymore. And particularly in the gear world at the moment, I can remember Brett Scholl did a video talking about the tariffs and stuff like that. And from my own personal point of view, with the GHS pedals, thing where I made a silly video with a silly title, and JHS kind of broke down some of what it costs to build a pedal in the USA. I think it's even more true that actually what we pay influenced by way more factors than what actually goes into making a guitar like this, in terms of parts and all of that. One of the things that JHS video put out there was kind of ideas around margin and things like that, and also the amount that you sell a piece of gear like this to a music store for, which is like, I think their margin on these sorts of things is something between like 20 and 30% based on what Josh was saying. Obviously that's going to be different with different companies, and I think the way that it works, now this could totally be wrong, so if you're working in one of these spaces, the companies that are bigger, like Andertons or whatever, will get slightly favourable pricing than, say if I was to start my own business and try and sell Fender guitars. Scale is obviously going to help that sort of stuff, right? Now, one of the other key factors is moving product from country to country. As we've now, this has been brought to light a bit more, but I was listening to a podcast about this. This happened a long time ago. The idea of tariffs in general, what they were originally created by, I think, Alexander Hamilton to do, was to basically make it harder for countries outside of your country to compete with your own product. So it's the idea of it is to bolster manufacture within the country. The idea will be that if you're in the US, that something like a US made guitar is going to be effectively cheaper than, relatively, than if you were to import something in. Now, I don't know whether that's changed particularly at the moment. I don't know if the things that are happening, I don't really pay attention to too much of this stuff because it's kind of depressing, whether things have started to hit properly yet. But basically, the cost of gear is totally different depending on where you're at. Now, some of you guys in Australia, I think you get a real hard hit on this. I think basically any piece of gear in Australia ends up being quite expensive. In the UK, I think we're like roughly okay, but I can remember a time when I could import like a guitar from America, and effectively it'd be about half the price of what it would be if I bought it in the UK. That's since not really the case anymore. There's way less in it than that. But it was the case for a while. So I can understand that essentially it matters where you are in relation to where that piece of gear was manufactured, because of tariffs and all this sort of stuff that has been brought to the forefront a little bit more now, but it's always been the case. And things like importing a pedal over from Japan, this is part of the reason that Vintera pedals to us outside of Japan look so expensive, is because we pay quite a lot to import those over. Domestically in Japan, they're actually quite reasonably priced, you know, like what we normally would pay for a boutique pedal. I think there is like a deliberate, I guess it must be deliberate, attempt to differentiate. So say you're Fender and you're making a guitar in Mexico, you're making a guitar in China, and you're making a guitar in America. Now, part of the thing here is that in order for the customer to really buy into this idea that, you know, the further you go up paying more and more money, they have to make a necessary improvement, I think, in specs. And that generally has been the thing that you would get, is that like an American guitar, a Japanese guitar to some extent as well, would have slightly better sort of specs. So it might be hardware, or it might be the pickups, you know, and it might be that more of those parts of that guitar were made in America and that sort of thing. I don't think it's necessarily so much the case anymore, and Fender in particular, I think, fall a little bit behind on this, because, for instance, do Fender make any guitars with stainless frets, which I think could be seen as like a premium, a thing that you could upgrade on a guitar? I don't think they do, and maybe if in the custom shop they do, but I'm not sure that I've heard too much about even that. So that's kind of one other aspect where actually there are a few companies now that really do pretty much put it to the test. So like PRS have said, it shouldn't matter where a guitar is made. Now there's actually very few companies that really put this to the test properly by making like a pretty much identical guitar in Indonesia and a pretty much identical guitar in Japan. There's a couple. Yamaha have done it basically with the Revstar, the Professional and the Standard series. Those guitars, if you look at them side by side, they're pretty much identical. Same pickups, stainless steel frets on both, and they look the same. They're using the same colors and all that sort of stuff. Likewise, Ibanez, they had their Indonesian AZ Premium, and they had their Ibanez AZ Prestige. Now there's very little difference in terms of those spec-wise as well. I think stainless steel frets on them, they use the same pickups across both ranges. It'd be interesting to know from an insider whether that actually ends up working for them, because I think what happens in the customer's mind is that you either go for, right, I want the best value for money, or you go, well, actually, because it's built in Japan and it is more expensive, I think there is a reason they're charging more for this, therefore I'll go with that. And I don't know whether that works out in everyone's mind the same. I think that's kind of a thing. And then the reason, of course, that these guitars cost different amounts, whether they're built in China or Indonesia versus America or Japan, is because essentially, like, it's the cost of having a human put their hands on the guitar varies greatly across the world. And this is kind of the difficult part and the ethical bit, which is not for me to really speak on particularly, but it's fair to say that if you have to employ staff and stuff like that, employing staff in somewhere like America, I think, is relatively more expensive than in some other places in the world. But not only that, there aren't that many places in the world that seem to be geared up to mass manufacture instruments. You've got like Fender, that Corona plant, you've got Mexico, like pockets like in Indonesia, like the Cordy factory seem to have more or less, I don't know if it's a monopoly, but they have like certainly a huge amount, like building for PRS, building for Strandberg, Cortec, I think they build for Ibanez. Like, that's a huge amount of guitar manufacturer that's concentrated in Indonesia. And likewise, you've got like China. It used to be quite a lot made in Korea. I think that's kind of gone down a bit because Cortec, or Cort specifically, moved to Indonesia because, I don't know how much can I say, there's a lawsuit, you look it up, but anyway, complaints around that. So they've moved from Korea, and kind of interesting, I think in China. There's also now stuff being made in Taiwan a bit. So all of this stuff seems to move around based on trying to get, I guess, the most guitar for the money to some extent. But there aren't that many companies that will just go, right, we're going to build the best instrument we can, we'll chuck as much specs into this thing we can, and just build the same guitar effectively in America, and then we'll build the same guitar in Indonesia, and people could just make their pick. I don't know, I think that's interesting for me at least. One of the things that I think might be worth considering, and this is still what's like a little bit difficult, is that, so for instance, this is the Fender Vintera. I think this is a 2023 model. Now this neck on here particularly is what I would want. So Fender don't make a neck quite like this, even up as far as like the American vintage range, where I tried my buddy Anthony's American Vintage 2 1961. That neck was really too skinny for me. And then likewise the American Professional 2, that neck's a bit too skinny for me. But the Vintera actually seems to me to be like a sweet spot where it's kind of like a good enough guitar, like quite good for the money, has the specs that I like. What is lacking maybe compared to like a more expensive American model is that it maybe feels a bit rough around the edges, and that's going to be different for each guitar and all of that stuff. But just buy a Mexican guitar potentially, if that's cheaper where you're at, for the specs that it has, and then take it to a tech. You know, a tech to transform this from an okay guitar to a guitar which actually, like, in terms of finishing, is going to rival a much more expensive guitar. That actually is not a huge investment. You know, you might be talking 100, 200 quid, but I think it could actually make a lot of sense for a lot of people, particularly if we're going to be in this state where like American guitars are suddenly unaffordable for a bunch of us, or whatever. And one of the things I found with a lot of Eastern guitars is that you don't get that many that have this sort of neck sort of carve, which is like a vintage 60s, you know, 7.25 inch radius, but with a bit more meat on the bones. I think it is a real nice neck. Other thing I think we should be kind of taking into consideration is that an expensive guitar from America costs a lot more than an expensive guitar from Indonesia, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. When we think, right, well, the staff cost, the cost of running a warehouse and cost of running a factory in different places varies massively, then we kind of need to have a shift in scale. Like an expensive Mexican guitar, what is that? What is an expensive American guitar? Or what is like the minimum that you're going to have to pay for a guitar that's made in America? Is it like an American Performer, like £1,200-1,300 is just the minimum you can make a guitar for? Is it better to spend £1,300 on a guitar made in China, Japan or Indonesia, and you get way more specs potentially for your money? and you could end up with a better guitar. It really does matter where the guitar is made, and look at what the specs are on that thing before you make your kind of decisions, I guess, because that is, to be honest, the biggest factor about what makes a guitar expensive is literally just where it's made, which is an obvious thing to say, but I don't know, something worth repeating to myself. And something can be expensive just because it's made somewhere, not necessarily because it's made any better than being made somewhere else, right? Does that make sense? I don't know, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And how do you have like a scale where it's like an expensive Japanese guitar costs this much? What's an expensive American guitar? What's a cheap American guitar? And how do you find these things balance out? Do you think like an expensive Mexican guitar maybe is as good as like a mid-priced American guitar, or an expensive Chinese or Indonesian guitar might be as good as like a medium-priced Mexican? Do you think these things are relative? I don't know. Catch you around. Sunday, I'm going to go and gig. I was just playing a Super Pro for this little bit here and a Fractal VP4 because I need to test that it works before the gig. Cheers for stopping by.